Shanghaied. Steph.
I hope Chaple-out.
That's Chaple-in.
Oh, God.
I don't want to see that.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
Are you not entertained?
I am your father.
Wait! Here's Johnny.
I'll be back.
It's not the car, it's a silly naughty boy.
Well, good movies.
Yes, welcome to Well Good Movies, the podcast that gives you the topics worth discussing and the movies worth watching. I'm your host, David Oscar, and I am back in control, guys. I'm here in the hosting duties after Craig's brief stint as the master of the endgame. Just like Thanos now, he's done his deed. He's retired off on a farm somewhere. He's watching the sun go down on a universe that is grateful. So hopefully now everything is restored. Craig has caused his chaos. Craig, how are things on the farm?
Yeah, so long as you're permanently in power, I will never stop.
That's not very Thanos-like. You're supposed to just go and retire.
He died. That's what happened.
Yeah, Craig has learned from the mistakes of history. It doesn't want to be beheaded. If you haven't checked it out, guys, we had a very fun special last time with our Endgame extravaganza in which we had 3 teams battle it out to be our champions. And today we have with us those champions, coincidentally, because we did want to get them back on the show as we haven't seen them in quite a while. They are good members of the Well Good Movies family.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
No.
It's so traditional. So yes, we have with us Hill and Stefanos Florakis back again, because today we are talking about themes and films that are very relevant to what they've come on and discussed before and are perfect for going down the realms of comedy and history. So we wanted them back for that. So today is going to be a very exciting, very fun show because we've got lots of interesting facts for you. We've got lots of big topics which are very relevant in the world today. You'll learn some stuff and, yeah, hopefully have some commentary on the state of the world and the state of the world 80 years ago through some nice satire and some great comedians, including Jim Carrey, which we'll get onto very soon. But first off, I wanted to get a feel for what these winners are all about as film goers, as film fans. So, like I said, they won our Endgame through their knowledge, and I thought it'd be a good chance to sort of get to know them a bit more because we didn't have as much time with that last time. We'll start with Stefanos because I think there's one clear film that we do need to talk about, which we didn't get a chance in the last episode, which was Phantom Thread, which Craig begrudgingly put into the movie vault. When it's come up on the show before, obviously it's had a bit of a bad rep, so you're here now, Steph, to actually support this film. Apart from torturing us, which is one reason I'm sure you put it in there, you know, what is your feelings towards this film? Why do you love it so much? Why do you feel it deserves to go in?
Well, right, to be fair, for one thing, I am a big Paul Thomas Anderson fan.
Yeah.
So there is a bit of bias to how I feel around his films. But second, I think that is the important one in means of actual objective criticism is that I have done a lot of study about Gothic romances. And for a lot of people, whenever they think Gothic, they're thinking about the dreadful horrors of it. Something like Hill House or like what Guillermo del Toro has been done in the past. But in reality, Gothic is far more about the darker side of any human relationship, but within the aspect of a beautiful sight scene. It could be either like a big manor or even a very solicit society. And the Phantom Thread really follows that, all this trend between the relationship, but also the dysfunction of it. And in the end, it kind of becomes basically this beautiful but toxic relationship. But it only works because the both of them are almost like as worse as the other. And I love it means as a character study. I don't and I totally try to understand why people hate a film, and it's not. Don't try to question that, but that's with also my own love of PTA and costume drama and Daniel Day-Lewis, all the stuff kind of like bring all together. Also, I'm a big Radiohead fan, so Johnny Greenwood on the score and him doing almost classic score from the silver era of Hollywood is very fulfilling to me, and it like combines a lot of the stuff that I love into one film. And to be honest, most of my favorite films are like that. It's never like a direct thing that I aim for. It's multiple different things, and it feels like a puzzle of all the things I love.
Yeah, and that's often, like nobody can say that, there's a film out there which is absolutely perfect because, it just means that people are willing to oversee certain flaws or aspects of them that maybe other people can't get over, etc. Obviously, notice that Steph did very well as well to get through that entire thing when Craig is just there giving him the finger throughout the entire thing. So looking very angry there, Craig, throughout.
Consistently, yeah.
But Di, like I said, we've had you on several times before, but it's usually been talking about specific topics or specific films. So we've gone down into the history of Frankenstein, The Invisible Man. But I wanted to give this chance to actually, ask, what are some of your favorite films? What are the ones that you sort of like cling to the most? Is it the kind of more historical ones? Is it, obviously we've discussed before about you love the King Arthur adaptations and stuff, but what is actually like, this is my favorite film, that kind of thing?
Probably Indiana Jones, the main three.
Yeah.
There's archaeology, there's adventure, there's faces melting. It's all my favorite things. I love those movies. They're just incredibly perfect. So yeah, that's what I would say is the Di Hill pick of favorite movie.
I actually saw that face melting used in something the other day. I can't remember exactly what. It might be something I sent Craig, but it was somebody, when you have those memes or videos in which somebody's done something crazy and they would just cut into loads of different crazy reactions, and one of them was like the face melting, and there's like this crazy music going on in the background. But yeah, it's just a perfect image to use for when you're completely blown away by something.
Yeah, it scared me to death as a child. I absolutely hated it, and so we just have to turn it off before that point happens.
Yeah, and the Temple of Doom is quite infamous as well for being like quite like scary and
bleak.
Dark.
Yeah, it never scared me as much. I really like that. A lot of people hate that film. I really like it.
Yeah,
less archaeology in that one.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so it still links into the love of history and adventuring and all that kind of stuff, but with a bit more fictional aspects.
A bit more shooting people.
Yeah. So today, rightly so, we are talking about history, as you might have guessed before. We have two guests that are very good in that realm, especially in the endgame. Steph and Di were using their knowledge of past films to help them towards their win. But also, we've been thinking recently about satires and comedy, how that can be used to help culture and help film, especially when we're going through quite dark times. We obviously got cinemas are closing. We've got an election going on in America, which I'm sure we're all loving at the moment. And, especially because, as I saw in a recent publication, it says that election will change the world and change the politics here and in America. So it's, a big talking point for people at the moment. But a good way to sort of relieve yourself of all that seriousness and darkness is comedy. And this year we've had, thankfully, Jim Carrey has sort of made a resurgence. He was in Sonic the Hedgehog as Eggman. We've also seen him sort of start to reappear in television series. So we wanted to start off our conversation about satire and comedy with Jim Carrey, about how he has had a history of being, this big figure in Hollywood, big comedian, a sort of jokester, a clown, but has recently been used in the SNL sketch, which you brought up, Steph, which parodied the recent debate between Trump and Biden. So what made you want to bring up the SNL sketch? What was it that stood out to you?
For one, Jim Carrey, he's not only like for the ones he didn't just come back for the one sketch. He actually going to be for the entirety of, I don't know if the whole season, but definitely up until the elections as Joe Biden. And, oh, excuse me, former vice president and currently presidential candidate Joe Biden, to be very formal about it. And it's interesting because there used to be a time where SNL was always political, but ever since the 2006 US elections, they've really had a stance on a political view. Up until that point, they were always trying to be as objective as possible and have both parties basically be either judged upon, commented upon, and even sometimes agreeing with. But after that, but 4 years ago, they had a complete belief on the one side of the party. And that has caused a lot of conversations and a lot of people who weren't really aware of some of the things of the then candidates and now presidents had learned it from SNL. And although, by the way, which is not always a good thing to have a sketch show to be your main political platform. But especially for Jim Carrey, someone who was such a huge name in the 90s, to come back to basically do this with Alec Baldwin also doing Trump as he's been doing the last 4 years is fascinating, and it really reminded me of a lot of other personalities in the past, comedic personalities specifically, who have done something similar. As one of the people we're going to talk today did something similar back in 1940.
Exactly, yeah. It's crazy how, it's transcended through the decades. When you were saying about, how they've started that resurgence as well, I was thinking of Melissa McCarthy. When she did the Sean Spicer, she always had the desk, and, that became like a running gag. That was very good. You also had Kate McKinnon. So you have a lot of, comedians that you see now in films or often carrying their own movies, which started in SNL, which has obviously been a big thing for quite a few years. Di, did you check out the sketch? What did you think?
Yeah, it's very good. I think what stands out, particularly in terms of Jim Carrey, is his physical performance in it, is the way he brings that, and he really shows the difference between someone of the scale of Jim Carrey and the quality compared to when other people try doing impressions and political impressions. Like the way he uses his body and then just his face as well to deliver so much is absolutely fantastic. And it really shows how an individual performance can bring a sketch to life. And they do make fun of him and try to find ways to poke fun at Biden in those sketches as well. It's just, obviously, Donald Trump is such a ridiculous character. It's impossible not to have a kind of a goodie when there's a sketch of Trump in it, because he's such an obvious, and particularly in that sense, they're reflecting that debate in which he was just interrupting all the time. And so I think when he's saying about how SNL has suddenly gone kind of partisan, they've suddenly chosen a side in politics. It's actually kind of impossible not to with satire, because you're always going to paint somebody more favorably than somebody else. And so it's a matter of people just trying to decide how they want to depict things. And now they've got a bit more open about it.
Yeah, especially with that sketch. I think what they ended up having to do with Biden is, I think they ended up putting a lot of characteristics onto him, characteristics that we would probably assume, right? So the sort of inner monologues of no, don't snap. Remember that smile you learned in anger management, which is something that, people basically transcribe onto him. With Trump, they were literally this is just the type of thing that he does, but slightly exaggerated.
But not even. I mean, well, because in the actual the real debate, they said he interrupted like 30 odd times or something. Yeah. So they didn't even exaggerate the amount of times he interrupted.
Oh yeah, but in terms of what he's
interrupted fewer times in the sketch.
But in terms of what he's actually saying when he interrupts, right? So obviously he's not interrupting, just doing things like gay, like in the actual sketch. But that's where like just the exaggeration versus the characteristics come from. So they are making an attempt to be balanced in that situation. But at the end of the day, if they're going to do a sketch about the American election, they also have to have a point to it, rather than just, haha, look how ridiculous this is. So I am glad that they tried to go for that message of just choose a better America, please. And that great slogan of make America not literally be on fire again.
Yeah. And I think literally, like you said, because they go with a joke for Carey as Biden, which we hope is in the realm of, you know, that story about how Disney World has the Hall of Presidents and they kind of thought that Hillary was going to win and they had to kind of dress up the robot as Trump. You know, maybe the same thing here. They're like, well, we hope Biden's going to win, so we're going to put in this really famous comedic actor to play him. And then it's like, if he doesn't win, they're like, oh no, we've lost Jim Carrey as Biden. But like Craig said, they're setting up that gag with him of like, you know, the inner thoughts. And like you said, Di, you know, he's got a funny face anyway, so he's able to sort of do that, you know, thing with his jaw. And, you know, you've got the great gag then of like, you know, don't rise to it, Joe, don't rise to it, you know, like, and all that kind of stuff, which is great. And but also, like you said, I think it will come up definitely later, is that it's hard not to make fun of Trump, of course, and it's hard for SNL not to take a certain stance, but often that's because that is comedy's job to do that. And we've seen that in Britain as well. You know, we won't go into detail about it, but we mentioned before the show, you know, Spitting Image has come back, which we had hoped would be, you know, a way of, you know, holding the government to account in some way or form, as they did back in the years of Thatcher, etc. As yet to be seen, you know, with what we've seen early on of the show. But that is the kind of stuff that we need and is very popular. You know, you have people like Jonathan Pye and Graham Norton, etc. Even just, you know, general chat show hosts, they'll poke fun at the prime minister or the leader of the opposition at the beginning of their shows because it's the easy gag to do. It's like the clear joke because everyone can get on board with it and they know what they're referring to. So outside of just the SNL sketch, what do you think is so pivotal about him as a comedian? Because like I said, you know, he's coming back from like the 90s. You know, he's been a big actor in Hollywood for quite a few years, but not so much obviously known for satire. You know, he's been more of a clown. Like you said, Di, he's got that sort of funny face. But, you know, when you do look back at some of his work, you got like, you know, The Truman Show, you know, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. So there has been that more serious or commentary type pieces. Do you think that he is quite relevant to satire in that way, or do you just see him as a sort of jokester?
Well, for the Truman Show, it's a good shout out because that, even though not directly a satire, it does try to satirize the very specific element of the media.
Yeah.
And as generally speaking, as Jim Carrey, is the fact that he has kind of always been that personality that he was always famous and known for his acting instead of his actual films. It's like his name became the name. That became the film. Like now when we have with Dwayne Johnson, like very few people will try to think 5 films of Dwayne Johnson in the last decades that is not Fast and Furious.
Yeah.
But everyone knows him. And that's what Jim Carrey was. And especially for comedy, there were a very handful of people who everyone would know without necessarily having these specific comedy minds.
Yeah, quite similar to like Robin Williams as well. You know, he was kind of that actor as well of, you know, like a Robin Williams film, but then it's like, you know, thinking of which film, you know, he's in. Not so much as much grotesque humor, like you said, but he was still that kind of Robin Williams in kind of, you know, actor, that comedic actor that they put him in something and they're like, okay, instant hit because he's in it kind of thing.
Just so bloody energetic, isn't he? You can't, you know, avoid him. And that's similar with when you're talking about Robin Williams. They're both uniquely energetic performers, which nowadays, in the last sort of 10 years, they've gone out of fashion because a lot of our comedies have become a lot more downbeat and, you know, become more officey in style. So you got like when they did the new Ghostbusters, rather than sort of, they're all just sort of standing around feeling a bit awkward and going,
yeah.
But Jim Carrey's of that school who just shouted really loudly and ran around on the screen.
Yeah, it's more sitcom-y as well. Like in my mind, I was thinking of ones and I was like Kevin Hart, Kevin Smith, etc. And I was like cringing as I sort of thought of it. I was like, oh, you know, that's not the same. Like I said, you know, you got people like Jim Carrey, Robin Williams, who created their characters. They, you know, developed them themselves. They weren't so much like Stefanos said of, Dwayne The Rock Johnson, just personas, like Kevin Hart just plays Kevin Hart all the time kind of thing.
I think there's also the degree to which there's just a wide array of appeal, right? I think the thing with a lot of like comedic personalities at the moment is they're very set with a certain type of audience, and I mainly mean this in terms of like age demographics, right? Because at the moment it definitely feels like relevant comedy is something that tends to be more towards the 20s era, as opposed to actors like Jim Carrey, who's able to basically just appear in a wider variety of mediums and be able to just latch onto basically any age group, so that there's just an absolute affinity for him. So I think that's why we're happy to see him back, because obviously we would have seen him during our childhood periods to begin with, as opposed to other comedians who just don't really have that type of impact. So that's why we think it's quite impactful that Carey is doing a character like Biden at the moment for SNL, when say other comedians could be doing it but just aren't doing it, but just haven't had like the same type of career to basically draw us in to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. You've got like the people who, like you said, grew up with him. You got the parents who are like, oh yeah, I remember, watching Ace Ventura with my kids, that kind of thing. The funny faces can still make anybody laugh. That's all physical comedy, etc., which is a big part of it as well. But like I said, all of this does link into what we wanted to talk about as well today, which is a big icon of cinema. So at the moment, we've talked about how, cinemas are struggling, but, what better time to sort of look back at cinemas, especially to like 80 years ago, to the silent era, which was, a big heyday of cinemas in which people would go see multiple films, and in which, comedy and satire were huge because people would go in droves to the cinema to all laugh together. And this person we're going to talk about, much like Carey, much like Robin Williams, etc., was, an icon because of his physical humor. He was a massive appeal to audiences around the world because it was a language that everyone could understand. He was a clown, he was a silent star, so it was just in his physicality of what he did. But he used his platform as well to bring many political messages and to bring a lot of films that people are still talking about today and using moments from those films because they're like, wow, this is still relevant in 2020 despite this being made back around the time of World War II. So that person we're talking about is Charlie Chaplin, a very famous icon of Hollywood. At the moment, The Great Dictator, which is one of his most famous films in which he parodied Hitler and the sort of developments that were happening around World War II. That is celebrating 80 years since it premiered in New York. Came out in October 1940. And yeah, Chaplin had an amazing career. He was one of the first big successful comedians and entertainers, icons of cinema. He was a big silent film star, along with people like Buster Keaton. He was born and raised in London, in England, so he was a massive British star. He went over to America and cracked America. He was born in 1889, which is crazy to say, talking about somebody who's born pre-1900s, and died on the 25th of December, actually, 1977. So he died on Christmas Day at the age of 88, which is pretty good going, because a lot of Hollywood stars, it's quite a shame when we talk about them and they unfortunately die too early on, or like in their 50s or 60s. But, he had a very successful career, and we're going to be talking about three of his most famous films today, including The Great Dictator, because like I said, it's a great parallel to what we were talking about with SNL, about having those figures which you just have to sort of mock and make fun of. I think it's only right, guys, that we start off with that famous speech just to get us in the mindset of The Great Dictator. Here is that moment from the end of the movie.
I'm sorry, but I don't want to be an emperor. That's not my business. I don't want to rule or conquer anyone. I should like to help everyone if possible. Jew, Gentile, black man, white. We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that. We want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery. We don't want to hate and despise one another. In this world, there's room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. The way of life can be free and beautiful, but we have lost the way. Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate, has goose-stepped us into misery and bloodshed. We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. Without these qualities, life will be violent and all will be lost. The aeroplane and the radio have brought us closer together. The very nature of these inventions cries out for the goodness in men, cries out for universal brotherhood, for the unity of us all. Even now, my voice is reaching millions throughout the world, millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people. To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish. Soldiers, don't give yourselves to brutes, men who despise you, enslave you, who regiment your lives, tell you what to do, what to think, and what to feel, who drill you, diet you, treat you like cattle, use you as cannon fodder. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men with machine minds and machine hearts. You are not machines, you are not cattle, you are men. You have the love of humanity in your hearts. You don't hate, only the unloved hate, the unloved and the unnatural. Soldiers, don't fight for slavery, fight for liberty. In the 17th chapter of St. Luke it is written, the kingdom of God is within man, not one man nor a group of men, but in all men, in you. You, the people, have the power to create machines, the power to create happiness. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. Then in the name of democracy, let us use that power. Let us all unite. Let us fight for a new world, a decent world, that will give men a chance to work, that will give youth a future and old age a security. By the promise of these things, brutes have risen to power, but they lie. They do not fulfill that promise. They never will. Dictators free themselves, but they enslave the people. Now let us fight to fulfill that promise. Let us fight to free the world, to do away with national barriers, to do away with greed, with hate and intolerance. Let us fight for a world of reason, a world where science and progress will lead to all men's happiness. Soldiers, in the name of democracy, let us all unite!
So yes, that was such an amazing speech that was made at the end of The Great Dictator and has become very famous in the world today. A lot of people might know it not even from that movie because it's been used so much in different aspects of pop culture. I think the first time I heard it was actually in a Paolo Nutini song. So it goes to show that, you know, it does translate into so many different mediums in music. I think it was used in an advert not long ago on British television. So, and you know, how great was it in that speech as well? We heard him say, you know, I'm now talking to millions of children, adults around the world. And by no means am I saying that this podcast attracts millions at the moment, but, you know, it's fantastic that he's still able to reach that audience because of the internet, because of those videos that we're able to see online. But, you know, apart from that, for many of us, this was, you know, our first time watching the full movie. So we had an interesting experience in seeing how this first full feature-length satire came about, how it plays out, because now we have many more modern satires that have been made throughout the years. And yeah, it was the first talkie from Chaplin, so it was a big moment in history for that. It was a massive deal when it first came out. And obviously it's become infamous because, you know, he does parody, you know, a big icon in history, which is Adolf Hitler. So, Di, I know this was your sort of first time experiencing the film. You know, what are your thoughts? What were your sort of first reactions?
Well, I had no idea what to think. I was surprised because the movie, Chaplin plays two characters in the movie. It focuses on this kind of spoof version of Hitler called Hinkler, but then the other half of the movie, and really most of the movie, and the plot of the movie is dedicated to this Jewish character who doesn't have a name. He's known as the Barber. Half of the movie is literally just exploring this guy's life in the ghetto, getting beaten up by stormtroopers, and the plight of Jewish people in the build-up to the Second World War, which I hadn't realised. It's so harrowing at times, while he's using this slapstick to talk about just genuinely getting attacked and people trying to murder you. And so, yeah, I was quite astonished that it had those dual sides to it, really.
Yeah, I never realized it was so much, like you said, there was so much emphasis on the barber, because when you see the plot summary, you kind of think, oh, how a barber is mistaken for, you know, this Hinkler character, and you think that that's going to be the major part of the film. That's going to be like in the center of the story, and you're like, you know, this is like an hour and a half in, and that's not even happened yet. So, you know, it's kind of telling that happens right at the end.
Yeah, it is a slightly weirdly structured movie in that there's sort of, it immediately sets up that he's playing both characters, so you assume it's going to be a sort of Prince and Pauper thing where they swap over. And it's only at the very end when there's just a random shot of Hinkler in a boat with a shotgun, and he just falls out of it and gets arrested, and then the barber gets put into Hinkler's place, and that's why he does the speech. But that is really bizarre that they just tack it on at the end.
I think that's why it works for me, though, because I think it's just one of those things where it sort of emphasized the message a little bit of like the type of ideology that's just being pushed is just one that's just incredibly fickle and just reactionary, insofar as you're able to just literally swap the person over and like literally having him deliver a speech literally contradicting everything that the Hinkler character was building up, and still having all of those people cheer. I think it was just a strong way of being able to just show how much the power and rhetoric was just the thing trying to win over like these people, and that's basically it's the terror of their rhetoric. So the fact that the swap only happens at the end, I think, is a good way of conveying that, as well as then we get beautiful scenes. Like one of my favorite scenes is where Hinkler is dancing with the globe in his hand. I think that's an incredible sequence. Yeah,
that's also like, along with the speech, that's another one of those sort of famous movie history moments, because again, it shows off Chaplin's sort of great art as a choreographer or sort of dancer, as a sort of mime, you know. It's just a great representation of dictators and leaders, you know, of just literally having the world in their hand. You know, it's great for that.
And then popping it and then destroying the world.
Yeah, and being distraught and crying into their sort of shoulders.
A lot of the time in this, the plot gives way to the political kind of aspirations of the film. I think he wants to show, particularly when you look at the context he was making it, he was producing the film in kind of 38, 39, when what was really going on in Nazi Germany wasn't fully understood. Chaplin himself didn't understand the full extent of what was happening. And so he clearly wanted to depict what was going, you know, the plight of Jewish people in the ghettos and things like that. And then the idea of having this speech at the end, it doesn't really make sense in a character sense. Like, the barber character never shows any inclination towards having a political speech. No. And the characters themselves, I think, are pretty inconsistent all the way through. They sort of flip-flop between being sort of brave and cowardly and intelligent and assertive towards being not that at all. And there's no indication that the barber character is going to have this amazing speech. In fact, he's been a coward all the build-up to him giving that platform. Yeah. He's been trying to avoid it and being a coward, and then he just suddenly does it. But I think when you look at it in terms of the context, America was still neutral at the time. A lot of people supported the Nazis in America at the time. Yeah. And so for him, it was really depicting this stuff, just purely showing these images on the movie screen, and then having that speech at the end was incredibly powerful at the time. And I think he was more interested in getting those images across than he was in telling a particularly cohesive narrative with his characters. Yeah. And in terms of the comedy as well, often the comedy, the slapstick juxtaposes quite awkwardly with everything else that's going on, where he'll suddenly interrupt the movie to have like a dance sequence for
yeah.
And you kind of think, what's this got to do with anything?
But it's also where, like, I did appreciate, like you said, I think that he does often talk directly to the audience, and I think, like you said, that was his moment to do that, to sort of talk to the people at home kind of thing, because he wanted to finish with this big speech. And I think the studios at the time were like, what are you doing? This is crazy. You don't end a film like with just a 5-minute monologue. That's mad. But like I said, there's several times throughout this film and other films in which he sort of talks directly to the audience. Like, I think you get the sort of love interest character. She sort of looks at the screen at one point, doesn't she, and said, oh, is this where it's going to change? And you know, as if she's like talking to God. And I think that moment is almost like that at the end. So while it doesn't really fit the character, it's almost, again, like it's his inner thoughts, because he even then says to his like love interest, you know, like, you know, are you out there? And, you know, it shows her face, and it just ends with her, because like they talk about, I think, about how important a lack of words are in that moment. That you can tell a lot just from her reaction and that look of hope at the end.
I think the fact they were definitely trying to push the Emperor of the World idea onto the character definitely shows the intention of the film, because notice how every time Emperor of the World is said, it's said with a lot more emphasis than all of his other titles, as if trying to basically be the warning to America of, if we don't stop him now, he's going to come for us. Get it?
Yeah, and it's quite similar to other representations we've had with controversial themes in movies, especially with, like I said, Nazism, etc. And I was trying to think of it in the context of, like, if you were to go watch this as somebody, like I said, who might have supported the Nazis or not thought it was that bad a thing. So I was trying to think of it in that context. And my most recent example I could think of was American Sniper, in which, like I said, I went to see that film, was just like, I'm really uncomfortable by this because I don't like the American patriotism and glorifying the Iraq War, which I think that in the American lens is seen as like, oh yeah, what a great film, like showing this American hero, which then to a lot of other people came across as like, this is really bad taste kind of thing, which maybe that's what people saw The Great Dictator as back when it first originally came out.
It's actually a very good point that you brought up American Sniper, because I remember watching it. I remember all that stuff coming out, and I was on neither side. I was actually from on the side that, or at least for me, how I interpreted it, was actually a critique on the obsession of the American military to do these missions.
Yeah,
that's how I read it, and the inherent trauma that comes after doing those missions. And that also that becomes almost a level to an addiction for some soldiers.
Yeah.
And yeah, the ones I like hearing all the stuff from both sides, I kind of really disagreed very much so. But again, I think that is the matter which it really depends to. I think it depends to a lot of things. It depends to how much you know of the subject, and how much of films of that genre you have seen. There's a lot of stuff, and especially with someone with Clint Eastwood, which I know both hear a lot about his personal life, but also his film life, which is very juxtaposing sometimes. I could see what he was trying to do. And like you said, The Great Dictator is another film which did something very similar back then, because for us right now, we can understand where he was coming from. We understand the context of it. But back then, especially, like we also said that around that time, a lot of people didn't know what to think about that specific character, or just generally the idea of fascism. So for them, some people interpret it as being a glorification of Hitler instead of actual critique. And of course, some other people later on thought of it as a communist propaganda, which we'll come to that later.
Mm-hmm.
But it kind of is funny because it just goes back to what I said before, that it really depends to what you see in the film, and based on your own preferences or psychology or your political beliefs, you will see what you want to see.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's also a great example, like we were talking about before with Donald Trump. It's that idea that Dai was saying about is you can't not make fun of him. So again, even if like Hitler might have been like the greatest person in the world at that time, you can't deny like looking at him that he is very much like a character, a very out there, strange person. And that's what Chaplin latched onto. So one of the things that I loved, which was a quote that he had, was, "The funniest thing in the world is to ridicule imposters and concealed people in high places. The greater the imposter you take on, the better chance of making a funny picture. And it would be hard to find a bigger imposter in the world than Hitler." So, like at that time, like I said, he wanted to, mock him, etc., because, he was such a big person in the world at that time. And again, that's exactly true with, Alec Baldwin playing Donald Trump, etc. Even though a lot of people can say a lot of good things about him, it's hard not to make fun of him because he is so ridiculous and he is such a crazy character. And I also love the fact that I think one of the behind the scenes I was watching, they said Hitler, the man who stole Chaplin's mustache, like that aspect of him being like, well, I'm going to get my own back on this guy who stole my look, and has kind of dragged it through the mud ever since as well. So I think that is fantastic as well.
How much of the German in that film was actual German, and how much of it was he was just shouting whatever syllables that sounded aggressive?
Yeah, well, no, it's just gobbledygook.
Yeah, exactly.
Considering he's like the dictator of, was it Tomania? I'm pretty sure it was just Swedish chef in it with cheese and kraken was my favorite. cheese and kraken.
Yeah, there was cheese and kraken. Titan Zebelton.
Yeah.
Did we think the film was very funny?
Yeah, I thought it was hilarious. I thought it was, well, I probably did get more laughs out of the kid, and especially for one particular joke, which I'll talk about later. But I thought there was quite even though I didn't burst out laughing as many times, I did love the Hail handshake. I thought that was a great visual gag. Where they kept so up and down. I loved the and like I said, even though I don't know whether I'm I know you said about the physical humor, how it doesn't always work, but I don't know. I think, for example, in this instance, with another film we'll talk about later, I didn't find the physical stuff worked in the context of that film. Here, I didn't have as much of an issue with it because it was a satire and it was mocking Hitler, etc. So I didn't mind that more clown aspect to the film. So when the barber, for example, was being chased by the rocket, I don't know, something about it just made me laugh. I just liked the rocket spinning around chasing him. But even said, the subtle things, the lines, I loved the instead of Führer, that Afui, please welcome Afui Hinkler. And but even just some of the subtle, sort of more political stuff, I loved when he was talking to his advisor, and he was just war will be the end of us. And he's like, do as I say. And he's like, madman, shut up. Very well. And then he's immediately there with a declaration of war. And I thought that kind of stuff was great. And just said, the fact that they're called the Double Cross Party, I thought that all of that was really fun. So I thought there was a lot of really good jokes in there. I did think it was a genuine good comedy because it was filled with a lot of jokes, I found.
I will say, I did laugh at times throughout the film. I will say, apart from the rocket sequence that David talked about, which I also did enjoy, just because of the physical timing element of it, I thought the opening war sequence was pretty bad. Because bear in mind, I watched it right after watching The Kid, right? So I basically watched a silent film in which all of the slapsticks basically has a lot of sound behind it, so it doesn't feel awkward. When you're then in the middle of a war scene and the slapstick is going on and there's no sound behind it, it comes off as really awkward, apart from just the occasional shouts of just, what are you doing, man? Get over here. And it's just, oh God, this feels weird.
Yeah.
I did have to the sort of it's oh, I found you guys. And they're like, hey, he's the enemy, and you got mixed up. But like I said, you did have that airplane sequence when they were upside down, that went on a bit long. You were you didn't really need to milk this as much as you did.
Well, so it's just a bit ridiculous. Oh, I'm so exhausted, I can't fly this plane.
I mean, to be fair, it was back then.
Yeah.
And especially for something like that, basically a war sequence in a comedy, it was almost unheard of back then, because back then, war films were specifically about the action and the drama. It was never about the comedy for it.
No.
I agree with that, but I do think there's a degree to which you shouldn't necessarily leave a sequence like that, which previously worked well because of the combination of visuals and music. Leaving it musicless or soundless is probably a mistake, and I'm surprised they didn't try and get some orchestration over it.
Yeah, I think it shows a lack of understanding of how the medium really worked at times.
Yeah, probably because it was his first talkie.
Yeah,
so.
With the particularly with the aeroplane bit, one of the big jokes in it is quite a good visual gag where the plane ends up flying upside down, but for some reason they don't realise. So when he opens his bottle, all the water comes out. But they give it away before the shot of them upside down. They show the plane as upside down, and then they show a reversed shot of them upside down but the right way up sort of thing. And so the joke is you meant to realize that they're upside down.
Yeah.
It's just not very well filmed, basically. And the elongated way of, they take a very long time in this upside down plane. And so the one actor is just kind of mumbling all the way through it, because clearly he's got like one line that he's repeating for about 2 minutes.
Yeah, because maybe it was his first talkie. Like I said, technically I did appreciate some of it, but like I said, I think once you get into the dictator stuff and the barber stuff, that's where it becomes a lot stronger. I also did love when is it Napoloni, the dictator from there, comes to visit, and they're having like their show off of their artillery, and they're like, oh, they're heavy tanks, and now the light artillery. And he's like, that is light. This is like no sound. Like that was a great moment of using sound effectively, having like, you know, the big massive artillery, and now the light artillery, and this is like a tiny little sound. And he's like, that is light. Like that was great.
That end speech is extremely iconic because it's timely. It's both timely and timeless. If you change some of the words in there, it can really work today. If you change like the words of radio and airplane into the internet and still airplanes, we haven't really changed that much.
Hoverboards, drones. Change it to drones.
Actually, drones not a bad idea, to be honest. So yeah, if you change that and put it on a contemporary element, it would work perfectly. And it's both fascinating, but also quite sad.
Going from the Great Dictator, I think it's important to, you know, we talk so much about, you know, Chaplin as a star, so it's kind of important then to sort of look back at him as, you know, his beginnings, apart from his short films. But, you know, The Kid, which was released in 1921, that was his first feature film and was, like Stefanos said, still a silent movie because he loved silent cinema. So we wanted to revisit this one as well, as to get a bigger idea of Chaplin. So why this one isn't so much like political or satire. There's still some commentary in there, but it does show off Chaplin as a silent film star, as a comedian. And, you know, something which is impressive throughout all his film is the fact that I think that he directs, writes, stars, and often orchestrates his films as well, which I think is fantastic. So, you know, what did we think of, you know, The Kid, watching again such an old movie, you know, definitely one of the oldest films I've seen in like a long, long time.
It's basically just pure physicality, right? And I think it was just great to see like Chaplin just doing what he does and being able to convey such a wider range of like emotions and scenarios just with like the way in which he operates. And just there were a lot of moments that I think emotionally works quite well. I think that like the dynamic between him and the child in the end was actually quite sweet. Even if I think that the reaction of the police was to try and send this child to the county orphan asylum was a bit much. Mainly because I'm just unsure about why specifically an asylum is needed as opposed to like, you know, a regular orphanage. But sure, why not? Tension. I also really enjoyed like some of the sequences, even some of the sequences that didn't need to be there, like the fight scene with just like the big muscular guy. It's like if your kid beats my brother, I'll beat you, and he just pulls the kid over at one point. It's like, yeah, he's a champion. Goes over, he punches him out. It's like, oh
yeah.
I had a great time with the film. It was just incredibly light.
Yeah,
that's what I liked about it.
It's just so charming, and like I said, that's the effect that a lot of silent films can have, you know, and it adds to it as well with those typical sort of like sped up sort of sequences, the fast motion of it. I had the same reaction with the fight scene. I just love like that little kid just like going at it all the time and him just sort of like pushing him away, etc. And I think the moment is where the policeman tries to sort of break up the fight between the brother and Chaplin, and he just knocks this policeman
straight out. He's just there for the rest of the scene.
Yeah, just like spread out on the floor. I love that. Yeah, and it's just the physical aspect of him. We were talking earlier about like other comedians and stuff, and it made me think as well as like somebody I grew up with a lot was Mr. Bean. Like Rowan Atkinson, like that's another actor, comedian who, you know, hasn't become like Jim Carrey and stuff, in which is like Rowan Atkinson as, but it's a fantastic example of a character who's largely silent, is a lot of physical comedy, and, you know, you can see them watching The Kid why you know, Chaplin was such an influence, because it's just something about his look. He just makes you smile, just the way that he moves. I think it's because he doesn't look like a stereotypical Hollywood star either. He looks like a sort of an uncle, you know, some like a grandfather, somebody you would sort of know in real life. Like the one subtle moment I loved as well is when you had the part where he was walking through the lane, and you get, you know, back in that time where people would be chucking buckets of rubbish and stuff outside of windows, and then he finds that baby and he's sort of looking up above in sort of horror of like, oh my god, has this come out of a window kind of thing. But just the way he does it, I just love his like movement and his like innocence and gentleness, and sort of looking up like, oh, where did this come from? You know, I thought that you know was fantastic, and just such a nice touch.
Yeah, and the core plot of the movie, I think, brings a lot of that out as well. Because the story of the kid is him raising this child in the slums, basically. Yeah, you've automatically got a basis to which you can like these characters. And so you really understand where they're coming from. And every single tiny piece of movement and all those things are really helped by the fact that they've got this core script that brings to life these characters. And so he's automatically an underdog. And it's automatically fun to see him kind of trying to get out of scrapes and having little victories and things. So I think in that sense, the plot of that movie is one of the most cohesive, I think, of the three we saw. And that's what I think really elevates a lot of the humor in it.
I will also say it was nice to have a film with a good child actor in it. I think it just reaffirms to me. Yeah. I think it just reaffirms to me a lot of child actors can be good if we just don't hear them talk.
I was thinking that.
I will say the other problem kid is obviously the one he fights, and that kid is one of the ugliest kids I've ever seen in my life. Like, wow. Jesus Christ, I looked at him and thought, ugh. I don't know why that was an instant reaction. I was glad he was getting the shit kicked out of him.
Oh my God.
You look at that kid and tell me there's anything to love about it. Even his brother was weird. I mean, like, a man does not look like that.
Yeah, that guy had definitely been sort of like altered to look more sinister and more strange.
Speaking of things altered to look more sinister, what the hell was up with that dream sequence, though?
Again, it reminded me, though, again, of that like classic Hollywood, that idea of like the Georges Méliès sort of strange fantasy elements of like, you know, why are we here and why are we doing this? But it did lead to my absolute fate. I haven't laughed like this in a long time. And I think Craig will understand why I found it funny, because this is often something we'll just laugh at. And it's just, I don't think it was intended to be funny, but I just found it hilarious. And it was just the fact that everyone was in these angel wings and costumes, and he's looking around, and then this dog just like comes in on like a string, and the dog clearly just looks like, why am I here? What am I doing? Like, probably looking at his owner like, mummy, and they're just like watching the dog like, ooh, and then it just floats away again. It just comes in like, hi, and then just like drifts back out. I rewinded it about 3 times because I just loved the look on this dog's face of just like, I don't want to be here. You know when you dress a dog up like in a jumper or something, and it kind of just has that awkward like, why are you doing this to me? That was the look that this dog had, and I absolutely loved it. And also just classic Hollywood kind of special effects of just literally the dog just droops in on like a wire and just like levitates back out again. I just thought that was amazing.
I mean, to be fair, it was not bad wiring. It was actually pretty good.
Yeah, I rewound it a few times and was like, yeah, I can't see the like strings, so yeah, fair play.
It's just charming, and I think that is the big thing that made Chaplin such a star, because he always touched upon some stories, like you said, simple but relatable. He always tried to go with something universal. What is more universal than taking care of a child and you loving it as your own? It's something that's, especially around that time, because through the Depression era, there were unfortunately many kids, many orphans, and a lot of them unfortunately were not as lucky as the child. So to have that like small sense of hope for this being possible, it really elevated people back then.
And Chaplin himself was like, he had been in workhouses and stuff as a child. Like he really, like, I think a lot of people cite Chaplin as like one of the biggest rag to riches stories ever told, because he literally was like dirt poor. His family were like, unemployed, really came from a harsh background. Really dark things happen, with like death in his family. He was like having to work in, like I said, these workhouses, etc. So a lot of that, I think, reflects his own relationship with his own mother and his own experiences as well.
Yeah, especially with his mother, especially with the mother character in the film. It very much is basically. I think that was something I really appreciated, especially back then, because usually back then they will try to. If a mother character would do something like that to the kid at the beginning, just embedding it, they will make her as the villain. But instead, he tried to give an empathy to her, showing her like she does suffer some level of post-birth depression, and also the fact that she is all alone, and her partner left her, or just simply forgotten about her, and showing that how generally difficult it is to do that on your own, but then changing her mind in the end, which is very common, fortunately, whenever it comes to mothers giving away their children. But one thing another realized by rewatching the kids and kind of like having all the flashes of watching all these other films, I kind of realized that his character of the Trump.
The tramp, you don't want the Trump.
Sorry, pronunciation.
Careful.
I was on the streets, I was all alone, and then I wrote...
all alone, and trying to find a child.
Yeah.
Basically, I realized that this kind of character, because this kind of character appears to the majority of his films, even his shorts, and I kind of realized that he really reminded me of the gunslinger character. It's like, especially on westerns, like where you always have the lone silent hero just going to town, just stumble upon situations and just saving the day. It's very much that, and it fascinated me when they tried to track that trope all the way to the present. And I was trying to find even beforehand of if there was anyone before, but they weren't as famous or specifically mainstream as Chaplin's. And when we say about Chaplin influencing comedy and some extent cinema, if you start thinking about that, you start thinking about characters you would never think that there is some association. Like, I would never think 10 years ago, especially 10 years ago, that Chaplin and Clint Eastwood have something similar.
Yeah.
One has to do about comedy, the other one has to do about westerns.
So what did you guys think of like our final film, which I think came out in 1957, was A King in New York? So this was like the penultimate film of Chaplin, and it was his final sort of big performance on screen. It was like his last but one movie. You know, a lot of what we've talked about is like reappeared here. So while we had The Great Dictator, which was like a big political satire, The Kid, which was a more personal film, a more symbolic of his silent film era, and the fact that A King in New York then sort of comes back as a sort of like commentary, but with a lot more cultural and political elements. It's not just one thing, and it's a lot about his personal experiences. So, you know, Di, you know, what did you think of like A King in New York? It's quite a different experience, I think, to the rest of his films, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's completely missing almost all of those sort of physical, the silent era of vaudevillian kind of humor that you come to expect from Chaplin. It's much more sedate and gentle. But yeah, I quite enjoyed it. It's there's funny in parts, but it's remarkably prescient, I thought. You know, so many of the elements that he brings up. So it's about this character who is exiled into the United States, and he kind of gets picked up by marketing executives and gets like tricked into going on television, and they start giving him facelifts and all these sorts of things, which is so relevant to culture today, having like kind of secret marketing and television shows and getting paid to, you know, eat food and say yum yum. it's things I didn't realize people would be talking about in the 50s. So I was surprised.
Yeah, it's like how modern it felt in some ways. Because again, that's why I brought up the Truman Show earlier, because that's what it reminded me of, like that idea of when Truman is just like, why are you doing that? When she's just like, oh, honey, would you like some bran toast made by, and that element comes into A King in New York when they're having that dinner scene and that woman's like, do you ever suffer from BO? And she starts that, monologue about it. And he's like, what are you doing? What's wrong with you? And that's what reminded me of the Truman Show. But yeah, and what you said, I was just thinking about it now. I was just like, oh my God, it's like the early reflections of Google and, listening to our conversations being like, I wouldn't mind learning guitar. You go on to YouTube or Google, advertising guitar lessons, buy a guitar, that kind of stuff as well, isn't it? So yeah, I'm quite scared. I'm quite freaked out now, Dave.
Chaplin predicted it all.
Yeah. Which they said that he did a lot, like we said, in The Great Dictator and in this movie.
Yeah, and like the dining scene with all the celebrities is definitely my favorite part. And mainly because I actually was studying about this several months ago, just trying to find maybe an article about it. And apparently a lot of famous actors at the time, as they were having contracts with studios to make their films regularly, they also had contracts with specific companies that they will only wear or use in public. And it is very similar to what happens now with fashion and perfumes a lot. Yeah, and I found it very brave of Chaplin to show that, because especially back then, I don't think a lot of like mainstream people knew about it. And I think that is the point, because this film, it is his first film outside of the US. So the restraints that he had before were completely gone. Yeah. Because I don't think that would have been able to actually happen in the US at the time.
No, and that's why they call it his most rebellious film, because, it literally is, he's been extradited from the US and he's literally like, well, screw you, I'm going to make like a film that's like criticizing your entire culture and, Americanism and all that kind of stuff, which, I think is quite interesting in itself. So the story around the film is almost more interesting than the actual movie itself, which I think is quite reflective again of what quite often happens with a lot of films and celebrities these days as well. So I think that is very interesting. I think another good example of like the reflection of modern day movies or like spoofs that we have is that cinema sequence when they're watching the trailers. That was one of my favorite sequences, in which they're just like, what's like the first joke, is it like, he's like, stick him up, she's like, don't shoot, and then it's like the trailer like, will he shoot, and it's like, find out, and it's like, and then the whole western shootout scene, and they're just like back and forth and just constant, that was like a great commentary, which again just felt weird to see in like a 50s film. You're like, oh my God, like you don't see that kind of parody and satire until decades later.
Yeah. It's weird, because as we were watching it, because by the way, this is like my first time watching it. I have never seen it before.
No, I never either.
For some reason, like even though I have seen like all his silent era and his first talkies, I'd never watched that. But while I was having that experience, I was really thinking, this is like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Like this is very similar one with the other. If Tarantino suddenly ended Once Upon a Time with a big conversation about what communism is, it would have been the same film almost.
Yeah. Well, that's again what was interesting, is we were talking about earlier with The Great Dictator, is the idea you were mentioning about like, they couldn't mention Hitler and that they called him like Hinker, etc. But when they made that film, Nazis took it as like propaganda to say like, here's why Chaplin is evil, and they were trying to make out that he was Jewish, and he was like, I'm not Jewish, like, he made it very clear, and they were using that film as an example as to why Jewish people were evil, etc., because they were saying, look at what this Jew has created, and he isn't Jewish. And he was very vocal about that, and like again through that speech it was very clear that he was just in support of freedom and liberty and ending wars, etc. But then the offset of that then, which happened years later, was then, oh, he's a communist. And again, he was like, I'm not a communist. And he was very vocal about that. And that's a big part of this film, is like his personal experience in America, in which he was like, you know, sent away from the country because they were the FBI were trying to get him, trying to make out that he was a communist, etc. And that, you know, is such a big part of the plot in this film. And you can see that because, you know, there's elements that reflect the McCarthyism, and I think the Rosenberg incident. I think he had a lot of sympathy for the Rosenbergs when that happened originally. So a lot of that is in this film. And yeah, it's very interesting that he always played it as like, I'm not a part of this group. I'm just somebody who believes in, you know, free speech and liberty, and, you know, he wants the best for the world. But somebody's always there trying to attribute them to something, because I think the reason the main way that they got him was through like a love affair, which again was like, that seems so reflective of today. They were like, kind of reminded me of Hamilton almost, that they were just like, oh, we got him now. He had an affair with somebody, and, you know, and it's that kind of idea.
Yeah. Well, it's quite shocking to suddenly see the whole thing turn into those McCarthyist show trials. Because it's no hint of it earlier on, and then suddenly the whole film takes this turn.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is quite brave, and it's one of many pieces at the time which kind of tackled that, those show trials, because so many of those trials targeted famous people, and so you got like Arthur Miller's the famous one who spoke about that a lot. But I do like how kind of ridiculously simple his conclusion. So his version of satire about the show trials is that his character goes into the trial, accidentally brings a fireman's hose in with him, and everyone sprays water at all of the politicians.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I appreciate for how incredibly dumb it is. From quite a sort of sophisticated movie, like earlier on, the satire is fairly sophisticated and intelligent in the way that the characters kind of drag through it all. And then it ends with just the most stupid thing you could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
Of just spraying water on the people he didn't like.
It does come across as just the clown with the flower kind of moment of just like...
Also just an absolute escapist dream, right? Just the idea of, well, this is all really dark and gloomy. Hose fight!
Yeah.
Exactly, and that's probably like the best thing for it, really. There are a lot of patched together different details, and occasionally it does suddenly fall into slapstick as well. And I think throughout all three of these movies, you can see sort of there's not always the most coherent kind of core themes and plot to what's going on. Like Chaplin seems to just throw in details that he thinks will be funny or prescient or whatever, and it doesn't really matter if they match up. So in that one as well, his character is more or less consistent, but then at one moment he's suddenly a complete dithering idiot when like he sees a girl through the keyhole having a bath.
Yeah.
Suddenly he goes from being this really graceful sort of, you know, pleasant kind of gentleman, suddenly being this idiot who's like scrabbling around to like peep through the keyhole.
Yeah.
Clearly it's just because he thought, oh, that'll be funny, and he obviously had less of an interest in character and more of an interest in just sort of whatever the things that he wanted to say as an individual.
Obviously, Chaplin is a very iconic part of Hollywood, so I think it's only right that he has a place in the movie vault. But what films best represent him from what we've discussed today?
Well, it's difficult because you did choose 3 films, which each one represents something very specific of him, and each one came out on a very specific time in his life, and so I'm not really certain. I definitely lean far more to Great Dictator because of how extremely relevant it is.
Yeah.
And how much of a brave film generally is. But of course the Kid is it's timeless. It's something that really represents Chaplin as a star.
Yeah.
But the problem is, like, as years passed by, he became far more than that character. He became the 2 characters, Great Dictator. He became another one later on when he left the US. So it's difficult to choose, to be honest. To be honest, whatever Die goes for, I'm probably gonna go with that.
Yeah, I love The Kid. I think the kid was my favorite of the three.
Yeah.
I thought it was really lovely, and it was funny. I think The King of New York is the one that we can not really. It's not as interesting.
Yeah.
Not as funny. It's not as good.
No.
Not worry about that one. The Dictator, I found watching it, because I watched it for the first time and I didn't really know anything about it, sort of thing. And so watching it for the first time, it felt a little bit almost shallow, sort of thing, really, until you look and realize that it was 1940 that he made it.
Yeah.
Like if he'd made that in sort of 1945, it's kind of a fairly almost like toothless kind of attack on the Nazis, really. It's and then the speech at the end is kind of almost arbitrary, really, of going to, of course, be nice to people, sort of thing.
Yeah.
But in context, when I then read about behind the scenes of it, and you realise that it's actually one of the bravest films, he could have made. That at the time and the context of it makes it absolutely incredible. And so, for the context of The Dictator, as a moment in history, I think that's kind of really deserving of being remembered. But in terms of being just a really good movie, I think The Kid is just a solid movie.
Yeah.
And I'll watch again.
I also think as well, given the fact that The Kid was an incredibly strong film in and of itself, but B, the fact that it was able to start that transition, I think is something that needs to be recognized. So I would happily say that The Kid should go in.
Yeah.
I also think The Great Dictator should go in, because while it is true that, say, as like a coherent film as we would consider it, it has aspects of it missing. I think that the moments that are strong are incredibly strong. I think the themes that are there are incredibly strong, and as well, like when you actually look at the history, I mean, there have been several films that we put in the film vault for more pressing reasons rather than just like its individual quality as film, but necessarily what it represents. And I think looking at it from that lens as well, I think it's a piece of cinema that needs to be recognized and celebrated.
Yeah,
especially for that speech. So I would argue for those two films.
Yeah, I would say the same. Like its impact and its influence is just as important. And I think again with the speech, I think I'd even say Die if it was even outside of the war, like made afterwards. I think that's why that speech is so infamous, is because again the moment of like don't be machine men and that kind of thing is again relevant even outside of like Nazism and World War II. Is like it's got many different elements that work in its own context as well. So I think that the film does work in that context, especially comparing it to A King in New York, which, like I said, sort of fizzles out the end of his career with lots of hodgepodge kind of stuff and doesn't work quite as well as a film. I think The Great Dictator is a lot based on maybe expectancy, and I think whether, like you said, I was surprised by it to be like, oh, this isn't what I expected, but I think, yeah, maybe like multiple viewings can sort of like add to it. But yeah, and like Craig said, the dance sequence with the globe and the speech, all of those are so iconic that it deserves to go in for those elements. So yeah, I think The Kid and The Great Dictator go this week into the movie vault.
The Kid and The Great Dictator sounds like a really, really weird combination.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, wait, that's Jojo Rabbit.
Yeah, I was going to say, it is, yeah. Going this week into the movie vault, melded together. So, yeah, if you have a favourite Chaplin film at home, guys, please do let us know in our social media. And yeah, let us know what you think of The Great Dictator, A King in New York, and The Kid. Like I said, and if you had never seen any of those films, now is a great chance to revisit them and revisit Chaplin, especially in times where we could all use a good laugh and a good smile. We now go on to our final moment of the show, which will test our champions, who will be facing off against each other instead of against Craig and every other team. So it's over to the endgame.
We're in the endgame now.
It's so annoying!
Okay, endgame time. So we've looked a lot of at Chaplin's later career, especially when getting to the end of the silent era into the talkies. But let's not forget the fact that there's a lot of films, including short silent films, under Chaplin's repertoire that I would like to test our champions at the endgame on. So welcome to this game, which is called Chaple-in or Chaple-out. I'm going to give you the title of a film, and I want you to buzz in and tell me if that is a film that Chaplin is in or if it is not. So I want you to say Chaple-in or Chaple-out. The idea is if you get it right, you get a point. If you get it wrong, your opponent gets the points.
Sounds like a Vegas wedding, like Chaple-in, Chaple-out. Get married, 5 minutes in, 5 minutes out.
It's actually more like marriage.
Okay, so this is basically going to be quite quick fire. So, all right, number 1, kid auto races at Venice. Die.
Chaple-out.
It's Chaple-in.
Nah.
Number 2, a film Johnny. Steph.
Chaple-out.
That's Chaple-in.
Oh, damn.
Number 3, Metropolis. Die.
Chaple-out.
Correct.
Damn it.
Fritz Lang movie.
I know. Yeah.
Cruel, Cruel Love. Steph.
Chaple-out?
That's Chaple-in. Number 5, Court of the Cabaret. Steph.
Chaple-out.
That's Chaple-in.
Oh.
Wow.
All right, number 6, Cain and Abel. Die.
Chaple-out. It must be
Correct.
eventually. Yes.
Next, Caught in the Rain. Die.
Chaple-in.
Correct.
Oh.
Next, Vaudeville Zambezi.
Either way.
Die.
Surely Chaple-out.
Correct.
Oh.
Next up, Laughing Gas. Steph.
Chaple-in.
Correct. Police.
What about them?
Sting and the. Yeah, he was Sting.
Die.
Chaple-in.
Correct.
Oh.
Not very
Lodger.
original title. What?
The Lodger.
Oh,
Steph.
Chaple-out.
Correct. Shanghai. Steph.
I hope Chaplin out.
That's Chaple-in.
I don't want to see that.
Behind the Screen. Die.
Chaple-out.
Chaple-in.
Yeah.
Tash for Mischief.
What's the first word?
Tash. Steph.
Chaplin.
Chaple-out.
Oh.
Damn.
Was that actually something else or just made up?
Oh, I made that one up. The Pilgrim.
Oh,
Steph.
Chaplin.
Correct. Current Days. Die.
Chaple-out.
Correct. Modern Times. Steph.
Chaplin.
Correct.
And on the record, my favorite one.
A Countess from Hong Kong. Steph.
Chaplin.
Correct.
His final film he started.
Souls for Sale. Die.
Chaple-out.
Chaple-in.
What? Who's selling souls?
Souls for Stuff.
What? Is that a sequel?
Souls for Stuff. Die.
Chaple-out.
Correct. And finally,
souls for gold.
and finally, Earth.
David Attenborough, Planet Earth.
Steph.
Chaplin out?
It is indeed Chaple-out.
Okay.
Okay, so now we've come to the end of that end game. So the final scores. Steph ended with 9. Di is the winner with 12.
Damn.
Yes!
Yay.
Congratulations, Di.
I'm winning everything now. I feel so good.
Wait, does that make it the lead attorney now?
Yeah, I get I own the belt now. Whoever beats me, I'll have to pass the
Oh,
belt
so
on to
now we
them.
have to change it to Hill and Florakis.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you guys for joining us once again. A very fun episode. Great diving into the deep realms of history of silent cinema and political satire, talking from everything from Jim Carrey to Charlie Chaplin. Tell us some of your favorite comedians at home and what films you would love to see in the movie vault as your favorite political satires. I'm sure we'll be talking about it again, as Craig would very much like to bring up certain satires that he was discussing before this episode as well. But where can we find you guys? Di, obviously I know usual place is just other episodes of this podcast and in life in general, is it?
Yeah, probably.
And Stefanos, where can we catch yourself?
I'm mostly on Twitter at SY Florakis. And also, if you guys are interested in other political satires, I would suggest to check Death of Stalin, Vice, and just for the fun of it, The Thick of It.
Yeah, Death of Stalin's amazing.
Yeah,
Also the American version of The Thick of It, Veep, which I think is far more intelligent in matter of politics than current politics in the US. And they're idiots. That's what I believe about the US right now.
I've seen good things about Veep as well. So yeah, check it out, guys. You can catch us as well at Fresh Take Hub on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And you can also catch us at our exclusive socials for the podcast, which is Well Good Movies on all the same platforms as well as on the website freshtakehub.com/wellgoodmovies. And yeah, please tell us any future topics you would love to see or any movies you want to challenge us to watch or put in the movie vault. Let us know and check out our many great episodes that we've done in the past as well. So thank you once again, guys. Anything lastly from yourself, Craig?
I just want to leave everyone with some words from one of my favourite silent films.
Thought-provoking, wow.
So
deep,
yeah.
Very deep. There was actually a title screen that came on screen, which nobody at home will get to see. Maybe we can finish it as the words of Chaplin: a picture with a smile and perhaps a tear. Thank you, guys. We'll catch you in the next one, and yeah, have a good one. Stay safe. Bye.
Bye.
Au revoir.
And now I'm done.
Oh yeah, that's it. It's the practice of kidnapping people to serve as sailors.
Oh,
Oh
wow.
God.
So in the UK, like taking the king's penny was what they used to call it. They used to like you took a coin and then you'd have to serve on a ship.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was what Americans called being press ganged into the navy. They called it
Right.
Shanghai.
Okay.
Yeah. Apparently, just because they were often sent to Shanghai, the ships would often go to Shanghai.
Right. Okay.
So that meant you were going to be put on a boat and then you go to Shanghai. Probably to sell people opium.